All right, let's get cooking. Welcome to the latest edition of Chin Check Sports Radio. I'm your host, JD. I want to thank you all for taking the time out to join us. And as always, we welcome any suggestions, feedback, comments, and criticisms, which improves the quality of our program, which ultimately improves your listening experience. Before we get started, I know once again that we are dealing with the pandemic of COVID-19. We are doing the best that we can during this very trying time, which is really unprecedented in United States history. And as I've stated on previous broadcasts, our passion for what we do here at Chin Check Radio, talking about the things that we enjoy talking about, we only hope to share it with you all. And we hope that our programming can serve as a distraction during this very trying time. Now, if you're listening to it with the family, if you're passing it out amongst your friends, if a wife is away from her husband secretly listening to our program, that's fine. If the kids are listening to the program, that's fine. If Fido and the dog and Mittens the cat are listening to our program, that's fine as well. We're all going through this together, and we will all get through this together. So this is just our minor donation, our minor help, I should say, in trying to serve as a distraction in this very trying time. For we might feel we're stuck in the house and we're catching cabin fever, and that's okay for the time being because these things are put in place to help us. But with time and patience, we shall get through this, and we'll be right back to rocking and rolling as we were before, hopefully. On this broadcast, we want to continue on with our Chin Check Radio all-time greatest boxers list based on the fighters that we grew up watching. And again, I always have to preface this by saying this is from the era of 1990 to the present. Next fighter up, and it's going to be a very complicated broadcast, because it makes you wonder, do we judge a fighter by the time that he was great? And how much does that weigh versus the entire career? Do we focus on the greatness and ignore the bad? Do we take everything together, the totality of the circumstances? Do we understand the losses but give greater credit to the wins? Do we dissect the wins? So next up is the brilliant Roy Jones Jr. And this broadcast is going to be a very detailed dissecting broadcast because, quite frankly, there's a lot to dissect about Roy Jones Jr. And Roy Jones Jr., let me say this right now, I would say, at least in my lifetime, I don't want to count the late, great, living legend Muhammad Ali, may he rest in peace. I didn't watch Muhammad Ali, but I watched Floyd Mayweather. I watched Mike Tyson. I watched Pernell Whitaker. I watched De La Hoya. And I just want to say that Roy Jones, I would say besides Mayweather in my lifetime, is the most God-gifted boxer that I've ever seen. I'm talking about natural, God-given ability to do things that fighters just can't do in the ring. Now, you have other fighters who worked hard at their craft, and we'll be mentioning them as we continue our list and as we continue our programming. There's been other fighters who have worked on their craft and they've gotten the most out of their ability. But Roy Jones, I would say besides of Mayweather, and even really more so than Mayweather, was born with superior physical gifts, really unlike anything we've ever seen in the sport of boxing, again, at least in my lifetime. So this goes to show you the type of caliber of boxer that Roy Jones was. Some people will say he was an outstanding athlete who was a boxer, and that might be true, but by the same token, if that was the case, then you would have more professional athletes becoming boxers, and they're clearly not doing that. So the way I look at it, I give Roy Jones all the credit in the world for being the fighter that he was, but he does leave a very complicated legacy. He really does, because you always wonder what could have been Could he have been still one of the all-time greats? Did he retire at the right time? Did he stay too long when he should have retired? So it's a very complicated legacy for a guy who really had the potential to go down as one of the greatest fighters ever. And I'm talking about along the same breath being mentioned with Muhammad Ali, Sugar Ray Robinson, possibly retiring undefeated like a Floyd Mayweather did or a Rocky Marciano did. I mean, that's the level of fighter that Roy Jones was. So it's something to behold and something that we're going to get into. So let's just jump right into it. We're actually going to start with Roy Jones's amateur career in the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games in Korea. At the 156-pound weight class, Roy Jones was robbed in possibly one of the most disgusting, and let me say this again, damn disgusting robberies in Olympic boxing history. Think of Evander Holyfield being robbed in 1984. This was equally as bad, if not worse. It was so bad that even the referee apologized. The fighter himself, Park Si-hun, apologized to Roy Jones because they were shocked by the judge's decision. And Roy Jones, to really put it into perspective, was probably, if you look at old film, was probably one of the best amateurs the United States has ever had. And that's including a Sugar Ray Leonard. That's including Cassius Clay. That's including George Foreman. That's including an Andre Ward. So Roy Jones, in terms of dominance, was one of our best amateurs that the United States have ever had. The man was so dominant, the man never even lost a single round en route to the final. So we're talking about the Olympics when you are facing against the best competition from around the world, not the United States, the best competition from around the world. And this man did not lose a single round going to the finals and steamrolled the competition even in the finals. Now, what separates Roy versus the aforementioned Sugar Ray Leonard, that 1976 U.S. Olympic boxing team is seen as one of the greatest boxing teams of all times. One can make an argument the 1984 Olympic boxing team is one of the greatest teams of all times. The 1996 U.S. Olympic boxing team that featured a Floyd Mayweather and a David Reed was one of the best Olympic boxing teams of all time. But in 1988, it really was about Roy Jones Jr. And that still, and if you watch interviews with Roy Jones, you can tell that actually still bothers him, the fact that he never got that gold medal, that he was robbed of a gold medal. And you could tell when you sit down in interviews with him, once he talks about his career and they do bring up that Olympic travesty, it does bother Roy, and rightfully so, because he should have a gold medal. And of course, they did investigations to see, what would have happened and was there any foul play, but it really couldn't prove anything. Yeah, I'm sure they couldn't. But at the same time, that, like, to me, that was awful. And Roy, he should have won. He clearly saw his emotions, crying in a towel. So definitely very sad. But moving on to his professional career, looking at some major fights here in Roy's career. One major fight is against a Jorge Vaca. A KO won January of 1992. Now, Jorge Vaca once won the Lanillo welterweight championship by beating Lloyd Hunnigan. In June of 1992, scores a unanimous decision over Jorge Castro. Now, Jorge Castro was also a world titleist who beat former trainer John David Jackson. So in that John David Jackson fight, which actually was voted the fight of the year in 1994, what was interesting about that is that now John David Jackson, if you knew him, he was the famous trainer of Bernard Hopkins and later on became the trainer of Sergey Kovalev. And you saw what happened with Sergey Kovalev. Just throwing it out there after he left one John David Jackson. And again, that fight was voted the 1994 Fight of the Year. And actually a very, very good fight. Jones beat him by unanimous decision. In May of 1993, on the undercard of Riddick Bowe versus Jesse Ferguson, Roy Jones had a unanimous decision over future world champion Bernard Hopkins, winning the IBF middleweight championship. He had a successful title defense against Ulani Malinga in August of 1993, KO in the 6th round. Another notable fight is November of 1994 against James Lights Out Toney. Now, this time, he had moved up, and it was his first fight in the super middleweight division, 168 pounds. And I remember that fight because James Toney was a well-known fighter at the time, had more of a name recognition because I used to watch a lot of James Toney fights on USA Tuesday Night Fights. Remember that, old school guys? Remember, USA, they used to actually have boxing, and there was some all-time classic moments on USA Tuesday Night Fights. Remember, wrestling was always on Monday, so you had the Tuesday Night Fights, and that's when you saw famous incidents where you had Riddick Bowe and Elijah Tillery getting to that incident. James Toney having different incidents and interactions. So Roy Jones moving up in weight to fight James Toney. I remember James Toney was popping off in the mouth. He was going to beat his ass and everything. And Roy Jones dominated that fight in unanimous decision. And if you go back and watch the video of the chicken move where Roy he imitated the chicken, because Roy, I guess, had a rooster coop and loved his birds down there in Pensacola, Florida. He spreads his arms out wide, which can make an argument. Now, I'm not into chicken. I eat chicken, but I'm not into chicken raising or roosters or cockfighting. But Roy flares his arms out to the side, slightly bends at the waist, which is, I guess, maybe what a chicken or a rooster would do, flare their little wings out to the side, which is what Jones did. When Jones bent at the waist, James Toney, matching ego, decides to do the same thing. Then Roy Jones then leaps in with the left hook and drops James Toney. So that was the standout from that fight, was Roy Jones using a chicken move on James Lights Out Toney. Another notable defense is June of 1995, a TKO victory, and actually rather brutal victory against Vinny the Tasmanian Devil Pazienza. What's notable about that fight was the first time in history a fighter has gone an entire round without being hit by a punch. The other fighter who did that was one Bernard Hopkins about 8 years later. So again, in a Vinny Pazienza fight, Roy Jones dominates Vinny Paz, and with that is the first fighter to go an entire CompuBox round without being hit by a single punch. In November of 1996, he wins a tough unanimous decision over the older Mike McCallum, aka the Body Snatcher. Mike McCallum fought a very tough fight, but again, he was an older fighter at the age of 39 years old. Really gave Roy some real fits in those first couple of rounds. Really was backing Roy up, establishing his jab, but eventually I think Roy's youth and speed, it took over the day. Roy had a late knockdown, and eventually Roy won the fight, as well as winning the vacant WBC light heavyweight title. So Roy has already won the IBF middleweight championship, the IBF super middleweight or the 168-pound championship, and now he's moved up in weight and won the 175-pound title. In his next fight after that, March of 1997, he fights one Montel Griffin. Now, Montel Griffin, in his previous fight, defeated James Lights Out Toney to earn the opportunity to fight Roy Jones. Now, when you go back and watch that fight, Montel Griffin was a shorter fighter, and it's funny because the strategy that Montel Griffin employed was crowding Roy against the ropes, landing hard body punches, and eventually sneaking a quick right hand upstairs. And Montel Griffin was trained by the late Eddie Futch, who trained the late Ken Norton, who trained the late Joe Frazier, who had upset victories against Muhammad Ali. And at that time, Roy's reputation was starting to be built as a possible heir or possibly on the same level as a Muhammad Ali with the flash and the quick hands. And the way Eddie Futch was, he molded Montel Griffin in that type of way. What a Ken Norton was, a Joe Frazier was taking a fight to a Roy Jones Jr. And I thought Montel Griffin did a great job. He did a great job of that. And it's funny, and I know hindsight is 2020, but that possibly was the blueprint to beat a Roy Jones Jr. So Montel Griffin comes out. They start trading in the early rounds. Roy Jones is very short with his jab, while Montel was sneaking in an occasional left hand while he had Roy's back against the ropes. He was throwing hard body punches anytime he trapped Roy, anytime he trapped him against the ropes. Now, Roy's, again, the hand speed started to take over. There was a questionable knockdown, I believe, in the 7th or 8th round, where it looks like Montel Griffin slipped and Roy Jones threw a punch at the same time, and the referee scored a knockdown. But even going into that 8th round, you can kind of say you had Montel Griffin ahead by 1 point. And in the 9th round, Roy started to take over, was landing hard punches, wobbled Montel Griffin. Montel Griffin is on his way to be down, or he's on his way to going down. At this point, Montel Griffin is staggering around the ring. He drops to one knee. Roy Jones hits him 2 times, right and the left, as Montel Griffin is down on one knee. The referee pulls him off. Montel Griffin looks at the referee, obviously in shock that he was just hit while his knee was on the ground, because that goes against the rules of boxing. He goes down, falls flat in his face. At this point, the referee starts to count. You hear the announcers, Gil Clancy, Larry Merchant, saying that was a foul because he hit the man when he was down. So instead of a knockout victory for Roy Jones Jr., it turned out to be a disqualification. And just a little side note, if you watch that video, the fight was in Atlantic City. There's a certain person sitting in the White House who made his fortune in Atlantic City, and he was actually sitting in the background of that fight. So go check it out on YouTube. So, of course, that was a huge upset, but not really a major one. It was one of those. Roy was disqualified, even though he was losing the fight, but he was starting to take over. But the thing is, he lost his first fight. Now, that disqualification, I want you to think back to the great John Jones of the UFC fame. His only loss is a disqualification loss to Matt Hamill of a fight that he was clearly dominating. And I remember watching it at my little brother Wesley's house back in 2009. Roy Jones, he took down Matt Hamill, was beating the brakes off of him, and was landing elbows in the 12-6 position, basically elbows from top to bottom or coming straight down, which is illegal, and Jones got the disqualification. Did John Jones was disqualified, even though he was beating the brakes off of Hamill, but he was disqualified. So that, I would say, is the equivalent of Roy Jones's loss back then, where Roy Jones was at his peak physically. So one loss, a disqualification. Some said he should have been undefeated. In August of 1997, just absolutely destroys Montel Griffin in the first round. I mean, just tears this guy apart. Comes out, left hooks. First left hook gets Montel Griffin's attention. Next left hook drops him into the ring, staggers him to the ring, and Roy Jones clearly was trying to take this guy's head off. There was no jabbing. Roy Jones was wild and reckless. Every punch he was throwing had evil intention, and he was trying to finish this guy. And he was just throwing until he fainted with the left hook. And then while it moved Griffin out of the range, it was a wide left hook that snapped Montel Griffin's head up. He falls to the canvas. He falls back first on the canvas. Montel Griffin tries to get up, rolls over, and literally staggers across the ring. And even as the referee is counting 7 and 8 and the referee stopped the fight, Montel Griffin falls right back on his face. I mean, very dominating performance. One can make an argument that was Roy's best performance, or most dominating performance in the ring as a professional fighter. So he regains the WBC Light Heavyweight Championship. In the very next fight, April of 1998, a KO victory over Virgil Hill. Now, the Virgil Hill fight, is significant because at that time, Virgil Hill only had one loss, and that one loss was to the great Thomas the Hitman Hearns. So Virgil Hill, he also had a victory over one Drake Thatsy, who also beat James Lights Out Tony. So Roy Jones dominating action and lands a crunching body punch. I mean, one of the best body punch stoppages in boxing history. If you really go back and look at the tape, blast Virgil Hill with a right to the body. Hills goes down, writhing in pain. Equate that with the Bernard Hopkins and Oscar De La Hoya body punch knockout. The next fight, July of 1998, a unanimous decision victory over Lou Del Valle. What's memorable about that fight is the knockdown that Lou Del Valle scored over Roy Jones. So I've talked all this about Roy's career, and this is the first time that he was ever knocked down. Actually, it was a hard punch that he was dropped with, but gets back up and wins by unanimous decision. Now, here's the problem in Roy's career. From the Lou Del Valle fight, from 1998 until 2003, there's always a question as to the level of competition that Roy Jones has fought. So we're going to go through the names and tell me if you recognize anybody. November of 1998 has a TKO victory against Otis Grant. In January of 1999, a TKO victory in the second round versus Richard Frazier. He unifies the light heavyweight championship, beating one Reggie Johnson by unanimous decision in June of 1999. Defeats David Telesco January of 2000. May of 2000, defeats Richard Hall by TKO in the 11th round. Defeats Eric Harding in September of 2000, corner stoppage. Defeats Derek Harmon in the 10th round, February of 2001. Defeats Julio Cesar Gonzalez, July of 2001. Defeats Glenn Kelly, February of 2002. What's memorable about that fight is when Roy Jones was backed against the ropes, he has his hands behind his back. You see Glenn Kelly with his sloppy looking jabs jabbing at Roy. So Glenn Kelly throws a jab. Roy then moves his head from left to right as Glenn Kelly throws another jab. Roy slips to the outside of Glenn Kelly's left jab, throws a right hand from behind his back that was against the ropes, and knocks out Glenn Kelly. So it was a very spectacular knockout. The quality of the opponent left a lot to be desired. And then the very next fight in September of 2002 has a TKO victory in the 6th round versus Clinton Woods. So we're talking a 4-year period. There was a question of the level of opposition that Roy Jones was fighting in the ring. Now, one of those fights, and please forgive me because I don't remember that fight, one of those fights was Roy Jones fighting as a light heavyweight champion, had enough confidence in himself to play a professional basketball game and come back and fight a guy that same night. So it is what it is. Only he can do that. But Roy Jones actually went to play a professional basketball game and then caught a ride, a flight, or however he got to the arena to defend his light heavyweight title. So there was always questions at the time of the level of Roy's competition. So that forced Roy to not only step up in competition, but step up in weight, where besides the Montel Griffin fight, this is where I think this is Roy's greatest performance. And I'm going to say one of the greatest performances in really boxing history, because Roy Jones moves up not just to the cruiserweight division, he moves up to the heavyweight division. And folks, let me put it into perspective for you. Roy Jones is actually a rather small light heavyweight. So he wasn't a large light heavyweight because he really didn't have that punching power that he had at, let's say, middleweight and super middleweight. So Roy, compared to the guys who was fighting, was actually a smaller light heavyweight. So you have a smaller light heavyweight moving up in weight to fight the WBA heavyweight champion of the world, John the Quiet Man Ruiz. Now, Ruiz is most famous for fights against the living legend warrior Evander Holyfield. Now, those fights weren't the most aesthetically pleasing fights because Ruiz didn't have a very pretty style, but it was effective. And it was effective because he was the WBA heavyweight champion. Now, you have to put it into perspective. At that time, the man on top of the division was one Lennox Lewis. That was the preeminent heavyweight at that time, established himself as the best heavyweight of his time. So Lennox was the man. You also had other heavyweight fighters out there. You had Chris Bird, Kurt Johnson. So really, John Ruiz basically was your top 5 or even top 3 heavyweight because he held a version of the heavyweight title. So Roy Jones moved up in weight past the cruiserweight division and moved up to heavyweight. To even put it in even more perspective, Holyfield started off as a cruiserweight before he moved up to the heavyweight division. There was a great documentary that was on ESPN that really chronicled Roy's move up to the heavyweight division, working with famed trainer and nutritionist Mackie Shilstone, the same Mackie Shilstone who earlier worked with one Michael Spinks when Michael Spinks moved up from the light heavyweight division to challenge and defeat Larry Holmes for the heavyweight championship back in the 1980s, and in the future worked with Bernard Hopkins as he moved up in weight from the middleweight division to fight the light heavyweight champion at the time, Antonio Tarver. So great documentary on ESPN about it. And Roy Jones dominated John Ruiz. I mean, it really was shocking because, again, there's an old saying in boxing, a good big man can always beat a good small man. But the question was, could an exceptional small man beat an average to a decent big man? And I thought Roy Jones did a great job. He looked great. He added quality size, quality muscle. For Roy was always a cut-up fighter, but he added quality size, quality muscle. I believe he walked into the ring weighing about 190, anywhere between 193 to 195, 97 pounds. I don't think he even cracked 200, even getting into the ring with John Ruiz. And John Ruiz clearly was weighing about 220, so he was giving up about 20-something pounds, almost 30 pounds, to a natural heavyweight power. The thought was that John Ruiz was going to crowd Roy Jones against the ropes, because that was John Ruiz's style. Tie him up on the inside, crowd him against the ropes, and land a punch to the body. Roy Jones did a great job of standing in the center of the ring. And really, in the third or fourth round, where Roy Jones cracks John Ruiz with a hard right hand that clearly buzzed John Ruiz. And that really, I thought that really set the tone for the entire fight. For I think at that moment is when John Ruiz knew that he was in there with a true professional fighter and a guy who can hit hard. So I thought the first round, believe it or not, I gave it to John Ruiz. I thought John Ruiz might have maybe stunned Roy a little bit, like when Roy fought back. But in that third round, when he clearly popped John Ruiz across the chin and it got John Ruiz's attention, Roy really kept that fight in the center of the ring. Roy was jabbing. I thought that was Roy Jones' best performance. And what's also special about that night, that was the first time, I think, in 105 or 106 years that a guy who once fought at middleweight moved up and won the heavyweight championship of the world. So it hadn't been done in a century, and I believe it was a guy by the name of Fitzsimmons who did that. So again, Roy Jones won his first title at the middleweight division, beating Bernard Hopkins in 1993. A decade later, moves up, obviously, through the super middleweight, light heavyweight division, moves up to heavyweight, and wins a version of the heavyweight title. Now, when Roy Jones beat John Ruiz for the heavyweight title, it was something that it gave rise to a bunch of new challenges, a bunch of new potential matches. You had Roy Jones versus Lennox Lewis. How would Roy Jones have fared against an older Lennox Lewis, who had partied hard over his victory over Mike Tyson? But Lennox Lewis was 6'5", 240-something pounds, solid, hits like a Mack truck. Could Roy Jones have fought Mike Tyson? And we're teasing about that, and that would have made great money. What about Roy Jones versus Evander Holyfield? So there were great fights on the horizon had Roy decided to stay in the heavyweight division. And it was always a question of, well, should Roy retire? Because at this point, he's 48-1. He's won titles at the middleweight championship, super middleweight championship, the light heavyweight championship, and now the heavyweight championship. What should he do? Should he stay at heavyweight and pursue those bigger challenges at the heavyweight division? Or should he drop back down to light heavyweight and fight a rising contender, one Antonio the Magic Man Tarver? Now, Tarver had been really goading Roy Jones into fighting him, calling out Roy Jones, making these outlandish statements. He scored a unanimous decision victory over Montel Griffin. He scored a victory over Montel Griffin, was calling Roy Jones out, was beating a lot of the former opponents that Roy Jones had beaten. And so Roy Jones, and here's where we got to do some soul searching about Jones's legacy. At the John Ruiz fight, he's 48-1 and is a heavyweight title holder. That is as impressive as a resume as it can get. I don't think at this point it gets any better than that. Roy was the top fighter pound for pound, no questions asked. He fights Ruiz in March. He has to trim down and get back down to the 175-pound weight class in November of that year. And I always felt that was a bad look. Wes, I know you're listening. We have had these conversations. It was a bad look. I don't think he should have rushed so fast to melt all that muscle away and move back down to the light heavyweight division. He should have taken his time, taken a year off. His ego got the best of him. He's thinking, I've already beaten John Ruiz. I can whip this guy Tarver pretty easily. So Roy moves back down to light heavyweight, November of 2003. Loses really the first couple of rounds, and that's more so because Tarver was a busier fighter. Now, clearly Roy is weight drained. You could tell he was doing an interview in the ring. He just seemed congested. He didn't look right. He looked very gaunt. So at that point, physically, he didn't even look like the same fighter that he was at light heavyweight. So rushing back. But again, one can make an argument that was really the first time that Roy Jones faced some true adversity. So in the John Ruiz fight, he stepped up and took a challenge that nobody think that he would have taken, dominates that, moves back down to light heavyweight, and then it really for the first time in his career is facing true adversity where he has a young, hungry fighter in front of him and he's weight drained. He's clearly weakened. Clearly weakened. Loses the first couple rounds, but really guts it out towards the end. He guts that fight out. He really found the greatness that he needed, and he faced some true adversity in that fight, not necessarily because of what Antonio Tarver did, but because you clearly tell that Jones was weight drained, he was weak, he physically was not the same fighter, but he won that fight by a majority decision. I still stand by, I'm sure Wes you do too, that Roy clearly won the first fight. Now folks, the next bit of information that I'm about to tell you is where we question the legacy of Roy Jones. So now, after the first Tarver fight, he's 49-1. Let's recap his career. He's won titles at middleweight, super middleweight, light heavyweight, and heavyweight, moved back down in weight, and recaptured his light heavyweight championship. Of course, the decision was too close for comfort. I didn't even really think it was really that close. The decision was too close for comfort. Roy's ego got the best of him. Listen to the naysayers. And in May of 2004, is TKO'd in the second round. Now, folks, there's a lot to digest with that. I thought Roy Jones won the first round of that fight. I stand by that statement. I think he won the first round of that fight. In the second round, he's actually winning the second round. You can see Tarver starting to make some adjustments. Tarver, who was trained by Buddy McGirt. And you see Tarver making the adjustments. He's now walking to Jones, but I felt Jones was getting off first because Jones was still the fast puncher. And at the end of the second round, as they're backing up, Roy's backing up straight. He throws a right hand, a little short right hand, that misses. Jones, while he's backing up, launches a left hook that really glances Tarver. Tarver then throws an overhand left hand at the same time when Jones is throwing his left hook, because if you go back and watch it in slow motion, Tarver Jones throws the right hand. It falls short. Tarver counters Jones, lands his left hand right on the chin. And if you look at it, Tarver didn't even see the punch land. He might have felt the punch land, but he didn't even see the punch land. He catches Jones right on the chin. Jones goes down. He's laid down on his back. Literally half his upper body is underneath the bottom rope. Turns over, gets him underneath the rope. Tries to get back to his feet. Kind of stumbles on his face. Gets up really at the count of 8 or 9. Stacks into the ropes. And that was the most shocking knockout besides Buster Douglas and Mike Tyson of my lifetime. And I really want to tell y'all a couple of funny stories about that. Julio, remember this? Me and a bunch of the fellas, and probably too numerous to name, were sitting at the house, we're watching the fight. It was a rainstorm. And the rain, very thunderstorm, old DirecTV. For my other DirecTV customers, you know how that goes. So we actually didn't even see the knockout when it happened, because in the next to last fight on the undercard is when the power went out. And these are a bunch of guys I used to work with together, Felix, guys from my old job. And so the power goes out. Of course, we're all trying to figure out what to do. We're talking about this, talking about that. Then when the power comes on, I see in slow motion, they already did a replay. And I remember in slow motion, you see Roy picking himself up off the canvas. And I remember screaming, oh my God, I couldn't believe what I was looking at. And you had about maybe 8 or 10 guys at this fight party. And we were just sitting there shell-shocked because we couldn't believe what we were seeing. So we saw the end of the action. So, of course, I told all my guys goodbye, and I went to my little brother's house, who at the time, he had bought his first house. And I remember this is maybe at 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. And he lived maybe right around the corner from where my buddy stayed at. So I went and Wes, I'm sure you remember this story. I knocked on Wes's door, and Wes knew. I said, Wes, open the door. He knew it was me. And usually he would come and greet me by the door. He literally just opened the door, walked back to his TV where he sat down at and just looked at the screen, and he couldn't believe it. And we just looked at each other just in shock about what had just transpired. So he rewinded the knockdown for me, and I'm in shock looking at the knockout. And when he watches it again, he gets up from his chair. The chair flies across the room. He storms off, and he couldn't believe it. So it was definitely shocking. Another funny story about that. The very next day, Mom, if you happen to be listening, I love you very much. My mother was being honored at her church for Mother of the Year, and rightfully deserved. So the first time that she was named Mother of the Year, of course, I'm going there, to celebrate my mom. We're there for her. I'm getting emotional as she's giving me a shout out in front of the church, and I get emotional crying over Mom. And you know what's funny? After all that, while I was sitting in the front of the church, I kept thinking about that knockout because I couldn't believe what was happening. Mom, please don't get mad. But I do remember sitting in that church, and while they give my mom all the praise and the accolades that she deserves and still deserves till this day. And I never forget sitting in front of that church thinking, okay, I feel great for my mom. I'm so proud of her. But damn, Roy Jones just got knocked out. So that's where the legacy starts to flip. So now the question is, after the Tarver fight, was it a lucky punch, or did that signal the beginning of the end for Roy Jones? Did that signal a decline in skill set for Roy Jones? So we got our questions answered in September of 2004. And another brutal KO victory against Glenn the Road Warrior Johnson. A brutal KO in the 9th round. And if I'm not mistaken, that was the week after the Bernard Hopkins and Oscar De La Hoya fight. And looking at it, Glenn Johnson came out, crowded Roy against the ropes, really used the Montel Griffin strategy. Crowded Roy against the ropes, wouldn't let him breathe. He really wouldn't let him breathe. Jones had his moment of brilliance every now and again, but the fight clearly was dominated by Glenn Johnson. And really, you can give every round to Glenn Johnson. And even the announcers, the late Emmanuel Stewart, Larry Merchant, Jim Lampley, they were there calling the action. And in the 9th round, Glenn Johnson lands a hard right hand to Roy Jones's temple, lands a left hook that really doesn't land, and you see Roy Jones stiffen up and he falls back to the canvas. Literally, his head bounces off the canvas, and you see a left leg slightly in the air. The referee counts him out, and it was very worrisome because Roy was still out of it for a little while. Like, he was still out of it. He wasn't moving, and he clearly was out. And I think we knew as fight fans that that was the end of Roy Jones as an elite level fighter, and it was hard to watch. The Tarver knockout kind of was shocking, but the Glenn Johnson knockout, we knew that that was the last that we would see of Roy Jones as the Roy Jones that we knew. So again, this where his legacy is now into question. You've had so much greatness, now you suffered 2 brutal knockout losses. So he takes a year off and has a rubber match with Antonio Tarver October of 2005, a unanimous decision loss. Fight's a very competitive fight. Me personally, I think mentally Jones was just trying to prove to himself that he can go the distance after being knocked out in his previous 2 fights. So unanimous decision loss for Antonio Tarver. In his next fight, kind of falls off the radar, fights Prince Badiajamu in Boise, Idaho. July of 2006, a unanimous decision. Fights in Mississippi against one Anthony Hanshaw, July of 2007. Fights his way back to the big time against an older, and I mentioned this on a previous broadcast, against an older Felix Trinidad, January of 2008. Wins a unanimous decision over Tito over a fight really that was a long time in the making. Now, during the Trinidad broadcast that I did, I'm talking about, now remember, when the Tito fight was made, when Tito moved up in weight to the middleweight division, when he fought William Joppy, and when Bernard Hopkins fought Keith Holmes, the conventional wisdom was Trinidad was going to be Joppy, he was going to be Hopkins. That was eventually going to set up a mega fight against Roy Jones. So there was going to be either Trinidad was going to move up to the 168-pound division, and Roy was going to move down to make a mega fight. And I remember, I believe it might have been the Hopkins fight, where people was looking past Hopkins and were holding up banners saying that Roy Jones, you're next. Unfortunately, that fight happened 7 years too late. Both fighters were older, and a unanimous decision victory for Roy Jones. Next fight after that, loses a unanimous decision to one Joe Calsaghe, the undefeated fighter, another great fighter. Other notable fights is a battle of the left hooks versus one Jeff Lacey in August of 2009. Suffers a brutal knockout against Danny Green in Australia, December of 2009. That was setting up the potential rematch with Bernard Hopkins in April of 2010, which did occur. And Bernard Hopkins won a very ugly unanimous decision. Right and wrong or evening up. Again, these are when the guys are both older. At this point, Bernard is still a viable fighter, the ageless wonder. Roy Jones clearly is not the same fighter that he was. And Hopkins wins a unanimous decision. And the next fight versus Denis Ledbedev, he is KO'd in the 10th round. And another notable fight in Russia in December 2015. Another brutal knockout against Enzo Maccarinelli, where Roy physically wasn't the same fighter, and at one point the knockout, the man was down, was knocked out. Just a brutal knockout. Very hard to watch. Roy's style, if you guys watch Roy, he had a very unorthodox style. It wasn't a traditional boxing style, nothing that you would teach a child to do at any boxing gyms. I mean, his God-given ability had to do with his just tremendous hand speed. I mean, probably the fastest hands ever. I mean, yes, I would even say faster than Floyd, faster than Sugar Ray Leonard. I mean, Roy would throw 4, 5, 6, 7 punches at one time. Amazingly quick, outstanding reflexes, great ring IQ, actually very underrated knockout power. Early in his career had great knockout power. Remember, as he moved up to light heavyweight division, that knockout power wasn't the same because you may be fighting maybe bigger guys. But really had some really great knockout power, was really an underrated body puncher. Landed some good body punches. I know people think of the Virgil Hill fight as a great body punch, but Roy, at the only time he really threw a body punch, but Roy had great body punches. But what Roy really didn't have a great jab. His jab wasn't really that great. Had a serviceable right hand. Had more of an overhand right than a straight right hand. His best weapon was a left hook. He had this leaping left hook that he would just he would just catch you with. It was a combination of a jab, but he would just wrap it around the opponent's guard and he would catch you with that left hook. So in terms of speed, Roy had it. In terms of quickness, Roy had it. In terms of reflexes, Roy had it. Roy had everything, but again, you wouldn't teach a young fighter, or I would not put a tape of Roy Jones to teach a young fighter, because he did a lot of things wrong, or I wouldn't say a lot of things wrong, things that defied a lot of boxing tradition. Now, his feints was beautiful. And again, I talked about this in the chicken move, the cockfighting move that he used against one James Toney. He incorporated that in his style. So definitely a lot of hand speed. Great ring intelligence. Again, probably the fastest hands that I've ever seen. Great reflexes. Great defense. Well, his defense was predicated. His defensive system was predicated on his reflexes. As he got older, he resorted to covering up against the ropes. Great ring IQ, good, excellent, very underrated body puncher, good, powerful overhand right. So, as I stated before, besides of Mayweather, the most God-gifted in terms of physical gifts that a fighter has ever had. So I give Roy all the credit. Now the question goes, what about his legacy? Because Roy Jones, he is clearly the best fighter, or one can make an argument, the best fighter of the era of the 1990s. You figure from 93, when he first won his title, until sustained dominance until 2000, maybe Tito, whoever, maybe Sweet Pea. But Roy, in most circles, is generally regarded as a best fighter of the 1990s, really into the early 2000s. Then you have the Tarver knockout, the Glenn Johnson knockout. So now the question goes, where do you rank Roy? If you were ranking Roy amongst some of your all-time greats, where do you rank Roy? Now, again, as I stated earlier, I think Roy was on his way to being mentioned in the same breath with a Muhammad Ali, a Rocky Marciano, a Sugar Ray Robinson. He is what Floyd Mayweather became, retiring undefeated, beating everybody, and basically rolling through the competition. But those knockouts, we have to take that into consideration, because that is part of a fighter's legacy. The same way Floyd gets criticized and unfairly criticized for beating people that he beat, we cannot overlook those knockouts, especially the Tarver knockout where he was a favorite going into that fight, and the Glenn Johnson knockout where he was a favorite going into that fight. So we have to take those into consideration. But with that being said, folks, if you guys don't know anything, go back and watch Roy Jones fight. He was a beauty to watch. We had the privilege of seeing him from a distance, going to the Felix Trinidad comeback fight versus Ricardo Mayorga. After the fight was over with, we were all kind of hanging out by the HBO booth, and I shook Jim Lampley's hand and Roy took a picture for me. So seems to be a very cool guy. Fans is kind of ribbing him, but he was having a great time speaking with the fans. So Roy Jones Jr. is one of the best fighters that I've ever seen growing up in terms of natural skill and ability. Some might argue that when Roy lost that ability to be faster than everybody else, when the hand speed wasn't the same, when he wasn't this amazing athlete than everybody else, mediocre fighters started to knock him out. I know Bernard Hopkins has said this during the interview, but it still doesn't take away from what Roy has done. Again, this is a man who won titles at the middleweight division, super middleweight division, light heavyweight division, and won a version of the heavyweight championship, a feat that had not been accomplished in over 100 years. That says a lot about this guy. So Roy Jones, congratulations for what it's worth. You made the Chin Check Radio all-time top 10 list of fighters of all time. So as we reach the conclusion of our broadcast, we want to thank you again. Where, how, and where you're listening to us, we definitely appreciate all the support. Definitely enjoy the broadcast. Share it with a friend. And until next time, this is Chin Check Radio. Sign off.